Hi, Pratap.
Hi, hi, how are you doing?
Fine, and you?
Fine. Princeton's very comfortable and wonderful. The news
Really?
from
No.
India is not so great, but that's the way the world is.
Of course, Pratap, as I've said to you, we're absolutely honored and thrilled to have you as a board member. It's a great honor for us. You're one of the most distinguished scholars, public intellectuals from what we call in the New South, in particular of India, of course. Let's start with the current situation in India. I mean, I know that your personal circumstances are fraught or tense at the moment. Maybe that's a nice segue into what that says about broader dynamics in India.
Yeah, in a way, India is it's a very important, I think, conjuncture for Indian democracy, where you have four tendencies converging, right? So one, Indian democracy is veering towards a much more majoritarian direction. Hindu nationalism is the ascendant, reigning ideology of the ruling establishment. And that entails a whole lot of things about the transformation of Indian identity, the way India looks at its past, possibly the place of minorities going ahead. But more immediately, India is also experiencing deepening state authoritarianism. Um, India still has relatively free and fair elections. Participation is still high, and Mr. Modi is extremely popular. There is absolutely no denying the fact. But the curtailment of civil liberties, the assault on independent institutions, the assault on academic institutions, the erosion of checks and balances, the control of this information order, particularly large sections of the television media, uh, directions to social media. Um, all that suggests that the standard mechanisms of accountability that democracies rely on. Look, the biggest mediator of accountability in a democracy is the formation of public opinion. And if that public opinion cannot be formed freely, you're losing the central way in which citizens connect to the state. And much more, perhaps worryingly, even more worryingly, in the last 2 or 3 months, the explicit targeting of opposition leaders, ostensibly using cases of corruption. In the case of Rahul Gandhi, a criminal defamation suit. But the fact that only opposition leaders are being targeted, um, only parties that refuse to ally with the BJP are targeted, and the minute they actually switch sides, the cases somehow mysteriously disappear or go on slow track. Uh,
Wow.
uh, th- this is reaching new levels. I think there are about 90 enforcement directorate cases against opposition leaders at the moment. Um, you know, so there is a worry whether this actually reveals something about the government's determination to hold on to power under any circumstances, and whether we can actually take a peaceful transition for granted if it looks like they're going to face a serious challenge.
It's quite extraordinary. And the way you're describing it, it's both it's much scarier than the situation was in South Africa after 2012, 2015, and yet very familiar. That sense of quite a full frontal assault on, well, even the language is tricky in South Africa. An assault on the state, an assault on democracy, and yet what has been so difficult to make the argument about democracy was that at the very moment of that assault, superficially, if you're an American political scientist, you would say, well, democracy was consolidated because we had an increasingly robust party political contestation. We have a free press. There was no attempt to curtail those sorts of civil liberties. And yet, increasingly, what we were seeing was political decision making shift away from kind of constitutional bodies, away from parliament as an institution. So we discussed a kind of shadow state
Yeah.
emerging. So Pratap, I wonder. So what we're interested in focusing on, as you know, what we've spoken about is this idea of we've been struggling with the language, not so much fragile democracies, because that carries a lot of other intellectual baggage, fragile states, which we're trying to avoid. We've come up with we're using, I think, a rather awkward expression, but one I increasingly like, sort of democracies that are delicate democracies. Right. A sense that they're fragile, but also a sense that there's something special about democracies that need to be preserved, protected, precisely because they are delicate institutions. But there does seem to be a moment when the democratic project more generally, not just in South Africa and in India, does seem to be on the back foot. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
So, I mean, I like the phrase delicate democracies, and partly because I think it travels well across sort of, different genres. I mean, I think, I'm in the United States for a few months right now, coming after a number of years. And I think, I think we shouldn't be complacent about the dynamics that US democracy might take over the next 2 to 3 years. Now, one way of, I think, getting into your question is to actually maybe talk a bit, if it's okay with you, for a couple of minutes about the India-South Africa contrast, because that, I think, gives a kind of analytical frame sort of to move outwards. It will be presumptuous of me to talk about South Africa. I'm hoping to learn from all of you, but at least from this distance, it seems that I think one of the interesting contrasts between India and South Africa at the moment is that in India, as I said, there is this sort of quasi-authoritarian moment emerging, and there is great concern about the fate of political institutions. South Africa institutions, they experienced a shock, but they're still resilient at some moment. And you did manage to kind of oust a corrupt president, at least. The press seems relatively free, those kinds of things, right? But the other side of the contrast, which is, and that's what makes the political challenge in India complicated, is Mr. Modi's government is not an incompetent government, at least if you look at its management of the economy. The Indian economy will not do as well as the government likes to think it is, or claims that it is. It's not on an 8% growth trajectory yet. But it's also not on a trajectory where you can say that there's a palpable sense of economic crisis. And in fact, many Indians are experiencing a massive increase in state capacity, kind of being built up over the years, the last 10, 15 years, where in many areas, delivery of social services have improved. India is having an extraordinary boom in infrastructure construction, right? And which is what actually makes the politics sort of so difficult, because you can actually understand why at least some people do not want to characterize this as a crisis moment. India's growth trajectory is decent. It still has challenges of employment, but it's hard to argue that inequality has radically increased. The unemployment and equality challenges have roughly been around since India liberalized since 1991. From a distance, it seems that that's South Africa's biggest challenge, that the stress point on democracy is coming from the challenge of inequality, perhaps less confidence that state structures can address those core challenges, and therefore the potential of political expression taking some form of violence in some ways, right? So that's kind of one interesting contrast, that the stress points have sort of slightly different sort of sources. I think the one thing that is probably common to both India and South Africa, but I think common globally, is, there is almost this sense that in all our societies, there's formal political power, and then there is power that is structured and maintained by elites in our societies, right? Business elites, bureaucratic elites, academic elites, bankers, financiers, lawyers. The kind of sinews of capital and professional classes that are supposed to maintain and run this economy, right? And I think one of the interesting things across the world is how much of a skepticism there is that those elites can actually manage the problems. There is great deal of even deeper cynicism that those elites have become part of the problem. They're not part of the solution, including, by the way, our tribe, relatively privileged academics in some senses, that we, in some senses, neither have the frameworks nor the ideas, nor, frankly, are exercising the accountability functions we can on governments and so forth. And it's that generalized suspicion of elites then takes different forms in different countries. I mean, how, in a sense, people kind of react to it. In some cases, it is coded as this elite is cosmopolitan. We need to become more nationalist. Brexit might be, in a sense, an example. I think the US is struggling with both the left kind of critique of that elite and the right critique of that elite, in some ways. And in India, Mr. Modi has kind of capitalized on that a lot. That look, the way I'm going to position myself is to say there was an old regime that was thoroughly corrupt, not in the narrow technical sense of corruption, which is it made money or favored particular business interest, but it was corrupt in the sense that it looked after its own interests. It kept India on a low growth path. Now, Mr. Modi is factually wrong about it in comparison to his own performance, but that's construction, and you have to give me time to, in some senses, transform this ancient regime. And any resistance that we experience in the process of this transition is actually that counter-revolution and the ancient regime trying to hit back. These are people who realize that they did not do good for the country, their power is not as strong. And that's a kind of interesting dynamic you're sort of seeing emerge in lots of different countries. I think France is, actually at this moment going to undergo something like that, where in part, of course, it's a serious reaction against threats to the welfare state. But in part, it's also a political claim that, look, this old, French elite, educated in the école supérieure, it's no longer capable of delivering what we need.
I mean, I think that framing is very useful for the South African case as well. I mean, it's something which I've become very interested in is sort of the nature of elites, the character of elites, and the form of their engagement. And yet, strangely enough, it's a question which doesn't pose itself naturally in the South African circumstances. And I think that's got a lot to do with our own intellectual traditions, which is much more interested in sort of class leadership or class factions and the way in which they engage, and this idea of elites whose relationship to classes is a little bit more ambiguous, perhaps a little bit more nebulous. These are not necessarily class elites, for example. Some of them are bureaucratic elites, some of them are elites which come out of political parties, so their particular relationship to class is much more ambiguous, and as a result, this concept of elite is not so well developed in the South African context. And yet I think that the nature of the South African elite is not adequately understood, and yet I think it's absolutely key to understanding the current situation.
Right, and I would imagine in the South African case, right? I mean, in a way, a lot of the elite is also of recent vintage. I mean, it doesn't have that kind of, I mean, it's a creation of the kind of the post-apartheid state in some ways, at least parts of it. So it doesn't quite yet have the character of a kind of ancient regime that
countries like character of 30 years. So this is, I mean, your framing is a kind of the Modi government is increasingly authoritarian and yet it's capable. I think there's a growing sense in South Africa, and it's manifested in the understanding of what the crisis is in South Africa, that the political elites, whoever they are not capable. And I think you have. So I think in France there's a great sort of disillusionment with the capacity and the capability of the French elite, which for so long has dominated the intellectual elite, the technocrats from the École Nationale d'Administration or the Grande École, which have so clearly dominated the French political scene for so long. And I think there's a disillusionment around that. In South Africa, that kind of elite never emerged to the kind of prestige or authority, especially in the post-apartheid period, but even for that matter during the apartheid period. And I think there's a growing sense that the elite that did emerge, a political elite, strongly linked to the ruling party, the African National Congress, convened by the African National Congress, who's tried to contain and managed the contestation between the different elites now for 30 years, and I think has lost control of that process. But nonetheless, is not an elite that foregrounded or put the emphasis on especially on skill or excellence, and especially on technocratic excellence. And as a result, I think we're seeing the collapse or the crisis of our institutions, often related precisely to the weakening of that kind of technical public policy capacity within the state. So I think that framing is very interesting. And again, it's very interesting to think of China, because there's a certain fantasy in South Africa around China. Sort of, it's often as a kind of a model of how we should be potentially. And yet, of course, that elite is monumentally corrupt. Yun Yun and the Gilded Cage, for example. I mean, this is a scale of corruption which is on a different level. And yet it's a very capable, corrupt public service. And I think this is, which is interesting about the South African case, is it seems to be that we have very high levels of corruption, and yet it's not a capable corrupt class.
Yeah, as you know, when we had discussions of corruption before, I mean, if you look at the broader processes of development, right, what has usually mattered more is much more the structure of corruption, not the fact of corruption. I mean, there isn't a single instance. And actually, even now, I mean, I think the contrast on corruption between advanced democracies and delicate democracies or fragile democracies actually is overstated. I mean, in some ways, I think, and the structure of corruption, I think you can think about that on a few different dimensions, right? So one is what our common friend, my colleague at CPR, Partha Mukhopadhyay, once used to call the difference between whole-scale corruption and retail corruption. And the basic idea, I think, which you see in the US Gilded Age as well, is that there is one form of corruption that, in a sense, percolates down to all levels of the state, where literally every activity that the state does becomes a kind of site of rent seeking. And the way in which you build political coalitions is you build this kind of massive structure of people who are complicit in corruption. And that's a disaster, because there's large numbers of people who have investment in this corruption. It's also a disaster because it actually means you're stealing from public services, you're building, you're denuding the quality of the state, at least at points at which it intersects with the citizen. There's kind of another kind of corruption, which is kind of high level, right? Which is defense contracts, infrastructure, where you say, look, you are in democracies, let's be realistic, you need campaign finance, you do need to, distribute patronage favors. And you do extract rents from these activities. But those rents, they can be done in a way in which a lot of ordinary citizens are insulated from the bad effects of corruption. And I think India is kind of going through this interesting transition where 25, 30 years ago, if you looked at the literature on corruption in India, it was largely about corruption in frontline services. I mean, literally every service, right, required some favor, getting a passport, getting land registered, getting a telephone, just the whole works. The poor accessing food through the public distribution system. Rajiv Gandhi famously said, only 20% reaches the poor, right? What has happened in India over the last few years is politicians have, in a sense, decided that there is enough rents to be intelligently extracted from building infrastructure, for example. You don't need to raid these ordinary services. And it's a win-win equilibrium because, most citizens feel the state is getting better. And I have to say that on that score, I think the Indian state has gotten vastly better. It's not just an achievement of this government. I mean, this model was first started in the state of Tamil Nadu, where it was, Jayalalitha, one of the chief ministers, was notoriously kind of considered corrupt at this high level corruption. But it's also one of the states that does actually very well in the delivery of public services, right? So it's that old story, right? I mean, don't steal from the poor, don't steal from education, don't steal from health. There's a lot of other action to be had, right?
Wow.
And I think even the US Gilded Age story, in some senses, was in part that story where a lot of ordinary public services started coming out of these networks of patronage and corruption. And yet we know there was masses and masses of high-level corruption. I mean, the oil contracts, the defense contracts, the construction contracts. So I think in that sense, I think and India is now in that place where this government is trying to build these national champions. There are 3 or 4 business houses very close to the government, whose rise is entirely due to favors by government. But honestly, most ordinary citizens don't care about that form of corruption as much. That's considered par for the course. You think its downside social effects are not going to be that great, right? So I think I think the interesting question in this corruption thing is, how do countries move from one structure to another structure?
So that's an extraordinary framework, and it seems to have sort of such wide reach, that framework. And what do you think, apart from a kind of a sort of elite decision making or elite change of emphasis? The way you describe it, do you think the degree to which the Indian civil service has become, have there been shifts or changes in the way in which the civil service is organized or recruited or expanded, a greater rationalization of the Indian bureaucracy, which may have closed down those opportunities for kind of low-level rent seeking? I'm just thinking of Tammany Hall in the US, which would resemble what you're describing. This kind of is that retail corruption or wholesale corruption? The everyday sort of rents on everyday activities, which are strongly associated with the kind of modernization of the American civil service in the 1920s.
So I think the retail corruption story. I think it's a bunch of things, right? So one obvious and simple one is, in some cases, technology has allowed a form of disintermediation, right? Technology can upsides, downsides, where there's a bunch of services you can actually directly access, and it's actually easier to track, hold people accountable. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve lots of problems, but there are lots of services where you can see forms of disintermediation happening. The second thing is, in some cases, you might say intelligent outsourcing and privatization. So, for example, getting a passport in India, used to be an absolute nightmare actually years ago. But the state has a partnership now. I think it's with Tata Consultancy Services. They manage, in a sense, the whole process, and it takes just a few bureaucrats to, in a sense, keep TCS accountable in some ways to particular benchmarks. So there are these low-level kind of institutional design solutions in some cases, right? But I think the big shift, and I think this also has an impact on the nature of political parties. So this could be a double-edged sword. Is, in a way, the success of moving to whole scale depends on saying, look, one, there is enough rents in certain parts of the system, as I said, infrastructure contracts or something. And two, we have a mechanism of distributing it downwards. So in the old form of corruption, you had to kind of build these ground up sort of structures of rent seeking. Robert Wade has this classic paper from the 70s, I think, on the market for office in India, which kind of very, and he based it on basically testimony that I think Prime Minister Narasimha Rao gave him when he was Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, and how the kind of system of corruption ran. It, as I said, involved managing lots and lots of people. Each officer would get a cut, who would then transfer, right, the appropriate amount to whoever was doing the collections. Now, with centralized corruption, you actually need to distribute sources downwards, right? And my hunch is, this is just a hypothesis, that one of the reasons political parties have got more centralized in India is because the structure of their rent seeking now is much more centralized. Uh, I mean, and this is not just true of the national parties like the BJP, but also regional parties, where one of the flip sides of that whole scale model, where there are very few actors involved in, generating large sums of money, um, is that then the way in which you create party structures is by saying, look, I bring these rents to the table and I have this ability to kind of distribute them downwards. Uh, so, and I mean, this is a hypothesis. As I said, I think it requires more investigation, but the centralized corruption has also gone hand in hand with the centralization of political parties. And I suspect the nature of their financing now has something to do with it.
Yeah, it's extraordinary stuff. I suppose it's something which perhaps we look forward to, that kind of centralization of, and as you describe it, I mean, I have a sense that this was something that was being attempted during what we call the state capture period. That one of the things that I think the Jacob Zuma administration was trying to do was to bring corruption, strangely enough, under control. That it had become so decentralized, that there were so many points of corruption, so many different elites taking their cuts at different points, that I think there was an attempt to try and modernize it, if you like, in and through the political party. Of course, that remark would be heavily, outrageously controversial in the South African circumstances. Pratap, I want to ask you a question though. When you gave the keynote address at the Architecture of Government conference, which then GAP NSI hosted in June last year, you used an absolutely captivating expression, one which I think with enormous intellectual promise and also practical promise, and that was the normative conditions of institutions. And I wonder if you would talk us through that idea a little more, especially in relationship to some of the shifts you're talking about are shifts in concepts and ideas around the role of the place of elites, the place of institutions. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about that concept.
Okay, gosh. So, I mean, it's a large, and someone interested in political theory, this is the question that gets us most excited. So, I came to thinking about that phrase, and maybe just a 2-minute detour to set some context for it. I was trying to come up with a course on global political thought in the 20th century, which was trying to think of what political thought means, particularly outside of the West, in 20th century. What are the main lines of contention? Often in Western universities, there's even a question mark whether there is a political theory outside the West. But we'll bracket that question for a minute. And in thinking about that question, and sort of reading around different geographical contexts, both history and political arguments, it struck me that most regions of the world, whether you take China as an example, whether you take what we broadly call the Middle East, I mean West Asia, or even Africa in different ways, right? That at the moment either of decolonization or at the moment at which they were in some senses conceptualizing what a future utopia might look like, what a future horizon of emancipation might look like, they framed the question in a certain way, which provided a kind of normative anchoring to not just politics in those countries, but those are the horizons within which almost all political thinkers kind of operated. And they're no different. I mean, you can think of the analogy with the US, 1776. Here's a constitution. And even now, in some ways, much US political thinking has to happen within the bounds of that 76 frame. France is still debating whether, what's the legacy of 1789 in some ways, right? And two things struck me in a sense about that process. One, how path dependent so many of these political debates were once that foundational question was put forward. So in China, for example, once the idea of the party state as a important political form, an effective political form, a legitimate political form becomes institutionalized, pretty much every argument now is being conducted in terms of the horizons of that party state, right? In closer to our region of the world, when I think of countries like Pakistan, Iran, even Nigeria, Egypt, this question of what a kind of modern form of Islamic constitutionalism would look like, right? So one, I actually was kind of intrigued by the longevity of those foundational questions that these countries still sort of, in some senses, how much they operate within the horizons of those questions. But more importantly, I think from the perspective of your question, is how much of the crisis we are witnessing at this moment seems to stem from a sense of the kind of internal exhaustion of those questions as well. I mean, it's almost like they're both inescapable, but they seem to have reached a dead end, at least in the way in which they were institutionalized and formulated. So I don't know if many observers will agree with this, but there is an outside observation actually that the rise of Xi Jinping in its own way represents a certain kind of crisis of the party state, at least what its official ideology was, what its kind of quotidian practices of institutionalization were. In the African context, right? I mean, as you know better, right? I mean, in a sense, the three questions that kind of ran together. One was, how do we make sure that the color line no longer remains the axis of global power? It's something African thinkers have been astonishingly powerful at articulating. I mean, sort of from Algeria to South Africa, this is a question that kind of cuts across the continent. The second was a framework that can come to terms with the plurality of not just Africa as a continent, but within each country in Africa. I mean, there were these different political forms, different ethnic identities. What is the kind of constitutional settlement that actually does justice to, in some senses, that concern? And then underlying that, this kind of transformation of these states into what looks like modern states. I mean, this kind of patchwork of kind of political arrangements and different levels of stateness. And those foundational, in the early days of decolonization, and you can think of apartheid as the kind of last act of decolonization in Africa in some ways, there was a fair degree of consensus, both around the importance of these questions, but initially some kind of consensus around what is the direction to go. So in South Africa's case, ANC was meant to embody that consensus, and it represented itself as that consensus, right? The Rainbow Coalition is another way of saying there is actually a kind of consensus, right? But now we seem to be at that moment where the questions still remain, and I think their attraction is in a sense obvious. But the consensus around what constitutes answers to that question has not only broken down, there's even a sense of, was that even the right way of posing the question in the first place, right? But there's no new deep ideological articulation emerging to replace that, right? So our politics is in this sort of limbo range where it's still trying to tinker around with a set of normative presuppositions, which at one level are inescapable, but there also seems to be a great deal of skepticism about whether they can actually deliver.
I mean, as you talk, I was thinking of the work of Peter Wagner, the German philosopher, who uses the expression "problematik" of modernity, of these kind of ongoing questions which frame the political community. And of course, one which I was wondering about as you were talking, which we are endlessly preoccupied with, like all political communities of the modern period, and that is the question of the people. Who governs? How does the people govern? Who are the people? What are its limits? And what are the institutions through which it exercises its authority and decision makes decisions. So we seem to be endlessly caught up around the questions of who the people are, moving away from sort of apartheid's conception of the people as essentially a white people. Today, the disavowal of the idea that South Africans become a non-racial people, struggling to constitute this idea of South Africans as what, an African people? Is that a racial register? Is that a what is that? Is it a cultural register? Is it a geographical register? Well, a geographical register in this context is difficult to sustain. So I think these questions of the sort of normative foundations of institutions, I think, is exactly where we are struggling with, precisely because there's no consensus anymore around what those normative foundations are. I mean, we can talk at length about this. I think it's a big issue in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Italian social theorist, his name is escaping me at the moment, who has this very nice line that we are now in an era of populism precisely because there is no people. And what he meant by that, I think, was sort of two things, right? So one is, of course, the sense in which you just so powerfully articulated. Who is the people? What is their identity? What are the terms of membership? And these are questions actually every democracy has failed and very inadequately answered. I mean, I think if you ask the question in the United States right now over issues on race, immigration, it's exactly a version of that question in different ways. And one of the great weaknesses of liberal theory, as you know, it's I think a wonderful theory of legitimacy. It's an extraordinarily powerful articulation of human dignity, but it's always had trouble thinking about questions of membership and collective identity in this way, in this way. And so one is that set of questions, right? The other is, when we talk about the people, so the good news about South Africa, at least from this distance, right, post-apartheid, is people have an enormous sense of political agency and activity. I mean, in some senses, it's there is a kind of energy in some ways. And yet, what we are struggling with is how do you design representative institutions that can channel this energy in ways in which different sections of the population feel they are not just represented in some crude sense of the term, is their ethnicity represented, but they are actually in some senses partners in this governance enterprise. And for much of its history, right, democratic theory has relied on a whole range of intermediate associations to do that. In fact, class was one way of doing it, right? Is the way in which you organize representation is around some kind of consensus between capital and labor. It's always a tense consensus, but that's the natural channel through which that negotiation takes place, right? And some societies will do it better, some societies will do it worse. I think one of the interesting things about this current moment is it's not clear what those intermediate channels of mobilizing social power are. I think when I think of Indian democracy, in the 70s, when we talked about resistance to emergency, you could actually call on the student movement, you could actually call on unions, farmers' movements had very distinct identities. And so there were all these kind of intermediate groupings that could both channelize power and in some senses create, a workable modus vivendi compromise consensus, right? Now, at one level, politics is actually a lot more atomized. I mean, there aren't these kind of natural economic or social groupings through which people choose to channel their protest energy or their political energy. So it kind of just spills over into these spontaneously created forms of, sometimes anarchic, sometimes constructive protest, right? And so this particular question of sort of, and what the social theorists meant by when saying there is no people, in the sense that it's not clear how the power of people is channeled through its articulation through concrete institutions and groups. Another example from the United States. I mean, one of the, I think, interesting things about the US at the moment, I mean, the US political parties were always weaker in some ways. I mean, because of the constitution of the Senate, you know, the control that political parties have over individual representatives has always been much weaker. Uh, but my colleagues in American politics kind of keep saying that one of the reasons the Senate has become a bit of a nightmare is because you again don't have this confidence that the two political parties are the natural conduits of expression of power. I mean, at least not in the way of this 15, 20 years ago. So it's not a question of two party elites just sitting down and coming to some deals. Senator Manchin will be on his own sort of, extracting his own pound of flesh. So it's this sort of eviscerating of these intermediate institutional forms, whether it's political parties or whether it's social groups, that actually makes the articulation of the people's power through these channels become more difficult.
I mean, I think we could talk about this for much longer. I mean, I would, Emmanuel Wallerstein wrote a book, or wrote an essay about does India exist? And of course, I cribbed the title and wrote a book about which was titled "The Do South Africans Exist?" So, posing these sorts of questions. Pratap, if I can move the conversation on a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more personal. I mean, what is so striking about you and your history is that you are one of the sort of foremost intellectuals in India, and more widely and more widely afield, and yet you've been both a university academic, but you're also founder of the Center for Policy Research, which was really a public policy institute. And of course, this is the resonance with my own history and my own interests, and perhaps with the New South Institute as well. Why did you not go the traditional sort of academic route? You become a university professor, and that's where your life is. Why did you move into the domain of the Center for Policy Research? And perhaps you could share a little bit about your own personal history in that regard.
Okay. So first two factual corrections. One,
Sorry.
I think foremost intellectual was. I mean, you're being too kind, but I wish that were anyway. I'll let pass. I think the second is actually I did not found the Center for Policy Research. It actually it's an old institution. In fact, strangely enough, it's its 50th year. But when I took it over, it had just been through a kind of protracted period of crisis and had. It was almost like starting anew in some ways. I mean, so and hopefully we like to think we gave it a new direction. In some senses in those years. I think my move into the Center for Policy Research was, I'll be very honest, accidental. We moved from the United States to India first in 2001. And I was actually very committed to public universities in India. I mean, in fact, unlike you, who actually had some real world empirical experience of political science, by training, I was a political theorist. That's what I love teaching. And I joined Jawaharlal Nehru University. In the hopes that this is a university one could make something of. And I was invited to build out a couple of new centers. And for a variety of internal administrative reasons, that did not quite take off. And so after about 2 years there, we were faced with this dilemma: should I continue in this university, which had even then a set of limitations, or do we look for something else? Now, the dilemma for us was, given the structure of Indian university systems at that point, there were very few Indian universities where you could actually make up your own courses, which is what I was used to in the American system. You had to teach syllabi made by some anonymous committee. And one of the reasons I joined JNU was that the one thing that was non-negotiable for me in teaching is actually being able to construct my own syllabi. I mean, obviously, under some conditions of accountability and oversight, but the idea that I'm teaching somebody else's reading list, which usually, was in a sense not on. But there were no other options in India. And so, should we go back to the US? We actually came back to the US in 2004. Briefly, Harvard had sort of kept a kind of line open. And then the Center for Policy Research came out of the blue. While I moved back to India, I had started doing public writing for the first time. More because it was a way of engaging in a democratic conversation. It also, for me, provided an extraordinary learning because one of the things I'm sure you have experienced with public writing is you get the kinds of responses, engagement, and conversations that you would not get just in a purely academic setting. And I actually found in those conversations, I was learning a few things about about democracy, about state, that my theoretical training, my formal academic training, I think was missing in some respects. I mean, including, frankly, what the activity of politics is actually all about. I mean, one of the things I realized early on, and I think it speaks to the South African and Indian predicament, is whenever I talk to politicians, if they'd respond, one of the things, if you ask them, why are you in politics? What do you think politics is about? The good politicians always say, actually, politics is an activity of social mediation. It's not about, in fact, and in that sense, it's actually quintessentially democratic because it begins with an assumption of plurality. Look, there's lots of agents with their own views and interests, right? And a good politician's job is, in a sense, to mediate the conversation amongst this plurality, to make some kind of workable consensus work, right? Which is a very different way from how we judge politicians, right? Politician hasn't taken this first principle position, that first principle position. So I found I was learning a lot about politics and the state. And the Center for Policy Research came up and said, look, would you be interested? Here's an opportunity to build out something. My first reaction was, you've got the wrong person. But they said, no, you've been engaging in some kind of public, dialogue. And as far as we're concerned, that's policy. And so I said, look, I'm happy to join. I have two conditions. One, we're going to reduce the average age of this institution. And two, increase the number of PhDs. Because it used to be an institution dominated largely by policymakers, and they were extraordinary ones. I mean, I frankly, I'm still awed by what they achieved, both as policymakers and as serious academics and scholars once they moved to the policy to a think tank setting. And so CPR took off, and I was just lucky enough to be able to get a fantastic set of colleagues. Look, I mean, the only thing an institution has to do is try and find some talented people and let them loose on the world and support them in doing what they do best. So that, I think that's where CPR started.
You used early on in this conversation, you used a lovely expression, of course, a theoretically very important one, and that is the notion of sort of developing public opinion, which is absolutely crucial to the work of democracy. And of course, one of my concerns about South Africa, and I think more generally, is the fragmentation of the public, which is related to this question of the people. So that so many conversations are happening in idiosyncratically or in private, or there isn't a shared conversation. It's also compounded by South Africa's very complex demography and histories and languages, etc., etc. But to what extent do you think CPR has played a role in shaping public opinion in India?
I mean, it's honestly, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, and one should never be a judge in one's own cause. I also think it's a difficult question to answer because I think it was the ethos at CPR that, you might claim the privilege of being in a think tank or an academic institution, but when you're writing in the public, you're just writing as a citizen at one level. I mean, I actually do think there is a way in which, once you're in the public sphere, you should not bring the imprimatur of your authority with you. I mean, all you say is, look, here's a good faith argument. People can take it up on their own terms, assess it, but I don't think exercising authority, saying we are the experts, is actually the right spirit in some senses in which to approach public argument. What I can say, I think, about the CPR days and years, and looking back at the work people did, is that people put on the agenda, I think, lots of things that were relatively under discussed. And you can see actually the ways in which those got. So I'll just give, I think, two examples, partly because you're familiar with these people. Uh, when I joined CPR, the discussion on climate change in India was practically non-existent. I mean, it was part of official circles, official negotiating circles, and in fact, there was a lot of resistance to it because in those days it was used to be framed entirely as a first world versus third world problem. The sense that, look, yes, there is a question of international distribution of responsibility and resources around a kind of just transition. But we also have to think about our domestic environmental governance story quite seriously. And I think it's fair to say, actually, that the climate initiative, Navroz, Lavanya, then were actually enormously influential in actually mainstreaming debates about this. Urbanization. I mean, my first shock at CPR was we had a major international donor come and be starting conversations about fundraising, and they said, okay, what themes would you like to work on? And we said, actually, we think urbanization is something that is relatively understudied in India. Urban governance in particular, municipal governance, is really weak. And even as late as 2004, 2005, the reaction was, oh, but from a development perspective, India is still a rural country. And what Partho Mukhopadhyay, as you know, Partho kind of single-handedly created this extraordinary platform for conversations around urbanization in all kinds. I mean, in some ways. So in that sense, I think you can actually trace moments around which a whole set of at least questions were put on the agenda. As far as actual influence goes, I mean, we used to joke amongst ourselves that if a think tank is claiming policy success, it's probably doing something wrong. One, because chances are you're too closely aligned with the powers that be. But secondly, and more importantly, I think, I mean, honestly, as you know, tactically, often your best successes are when you don't claim ownership of the idea, right? I mean, in fact, just even as a kind of smart piece of outreach, you actually make it sound like it was the person you were talking to's idea, as you were saying, So the way I think of think tank is sort of not so much in these kind of measurable things, but how much of that kind of stuff it can actually facilitate. I mean, in some ways, in an open tent way.
That's the kind of role which I'm hoping NSI can begin to play, or can play in a more fully in a greater way. Partly because it seems to me that the public opinion in South Africa is so fragmented, and I think what that results in the public policy space in particular is that there's not even consensus around what the facts are. So there's no shared sense of these are the facts that we need to deal with. Never mind a narrative of what explains those facts. And I'm thinking, what I'm hoping that NSI can play both in South Africa and more broadly, play a role in a body of evidence which we can agree on, or at least a large body of people can agree on, key people can agree on, in business, in labor, within political parties, within government, and then potentially even to develop narratives which can help move parties to some form of action. I mean, that's really what we're looking to achieve as the ultimate. And of course, CPR is for us is a model. I don't want to take up much more of your time. We really are coming to an end. But Pratap, it's a great honor for us that you've joined the board. But I want to know why did you join the NSI? Why? What was attractive to you about this about us?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's some chap called Ivor Chipkin who seems to do good work and is interesting, and I've always learned a lot from. So I mean, that's the kind of, the first level answer. But I think the second, I mean, I don't have deep knowledge of South Africa. I have visited South Africa only twice, but have had conversations with various colleagues who work with South Africa, and the opportunity of learning more about South Africa, which I think will deepen our understanding of both state formation and democracy. Because I mean, I still think for all of South Africa's, contemporary faults and challenges, it is, like India was, a kind of extraordinary experiment in the making, like India actually still is in some ways, right? And I think the deeper the dialogue we have across, and I like your New South framing in some ways, the more it helps us try and figure out what is contingent and what is necessary to the particular diagnostics that we are coming up with. I mean, sometimes, I mean, the great advantage of comparative work, as you know, is that you actually recognize that what you were thinking has some contingent local causes as part of a deeper trend, which then gets you to reframe your analysis, explanations in a sense, in different kinds of ways. Intellectual life in South Africa, I mean, has again always been quite rich in its own way. But lastly, and I think more seriously, most importantly, which is, one of the things the development experience of the last 25, 30 years at least convinced me, is that the global context is actually quite important. I mean, there are all these trends that seem to rise at the same time, fall at the same time, right? Whether it is democratization, de-democratization, liberalization of economies, and then kind of, now turn back to autarkic nationalisms. And we are also at a kind of juncture, both in great power politics and the future of the international economic order, where what we used to call the global south will have to play a much more critical, creative, proactive role. I mean, frankly, the drumbeats of war and conflict are rising amongst the great powers. I mean, there's just no question about it. I mean, it's actually scary. And this, and a think tank like, in a sense, New South, which I think does both. It looks at domestic politics, but is in a sense keenly aware of these international conjunctures of geopolitics and global power, could potentially be a good platform for even those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely way to end. I mean, especially on this notion of these waves, because of course the end of apartheid coincides with another great historical global shift, and that is the end of the real existing socialism.
Yeah.
And this, of course, this is why we use the term New South, partly because so much of our experience, the post-apartheid experience, the post-colonial experience, to bring in conversation with the experience of Eastern Europe and its movement away from the crisis of socialism in those places. And of course, so much of the ideas that frame South African conversation come from analyses of the transition from socialism in the Soviet Union, etc., the notion of state capture itself. So we think that's a very productive seam to mine, if one can use that rather awful expression. Pratap, I don't want to take up more of your time. We've had an hour. It's been an absolute privilege chatting to you again like this. But I'm very grateful to you for making this time, and I'm looking forward very much to engaging further with you. So thank you very
so much, and wish you all the best. This is an exciting venture. Looking forward to learning. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.